and we can get started. Thanks everyone for joining us.
And do we both have share screen, Joe?
You should be all set to share screen. Yes,
Okay.
and I'll even make you both the co-hosts. So there we go. Thanks for the reminder.
Mute.
All right, now I'm not muted. So first we'll start with introductions. My name is Karin Dunay. I've been a DSA member for a couple of years now. I'm maybe 3 or 4. And that was nice of you, Joe, to call me a teacher, but actually I'm one of Howard's students. Howard is currently teaching a class at SMCC called Capitalism, or Capital, a mini course. And it's very, very difficult for me to understand, but I have to say we've reached week 4 and I feel like I've made a bit of a breakthrough. So I look forward to seeing how much I understand at the end of 8 weeks. So I'm gonna be tag teaming with Howard tonight, but I just wanted to kind of make that clarification. And then I would like to just kind of introduce Howard. You can tell me when I mispronounce your name. Howard Engelskirchen is a retired teacher of law and philosophy and the author of Capital as a Social Kind, Definitions and Transformations in the Critique of Political Economy. His activism and study of Marxism reach back decades. He is currently teaching Capital, a mini course at Southern Maine Community College, and he will be leading our discussion tonight. Howard, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I'd like to add that Karin is a librarian at SMCC. So
that's our connection. Many of you may have already read Howard's recent publication in Pines and Roses. It was, I think, published on Saturday. It's called Understanding Economics, Where to Begin. And we're going to cover a lot of the same material in tonight's presentation. So if you read that article and you have questions, please bring them forward. And just a little logistic note, if you do have questions, there's a couple different ways you can ask them. One is you can just type your question in the chat, or you can just type in your name and then we'll call on you and then you can vocalize your question. And then you can also, we'll both kind of keep an eye on all of you. So if anybody raises their hand and they don't have access to the chat, we'll work on that too. All right.
Sure. Get the PowerPoint up.
Yeah.
Here we go. Wait, whoops. Let's go to the beginning. Oh, sound gun.
Towards the top, right next to animations, you can go to slideshow, and then
Yeah,
it's
I've got that blocked out. It looks like I'm on the. All right, let's see if we can. No, so let me here. I'll do it this way. Okay, now it should work. Now I need to share screen again. Oops. Let's see. All right, it's still, yeah, okay, we're ready to go. There we go, okay. So Marx and Markets, the title is really perfect in relation to it. We're going to, as Karen said, we'll cover the same ground as the article, but with a focus on markets.
So this is our agenda for the evening. We're going to talk about the product of labor under capitalism, and what do markets do, and what is it that accounts for the dominance of market exchange. We're going to start with a topic of the double separation, and then we're going to move over to capitalist markets and how they overcome capital separations. And then we're going to end with a socialist alternative, which is restoring the original union between labor and its tools and resources in a new historical form. But we'll backtrack to the beginning. So, Howard, what is it that markets do?
Okay, so in order to understand markets and their place in capitalism, we have to understand capital's structural foundation, and that's the double separation. So here's a sort of duh question. Whatever the social form of production, laborers and the means of production always remain factors of it. But in a state of separation from each other, either of these factors can be such only potentially. You know, that's again, duh. You got to have workers and you got to have the means of production. And if those are separated, no production's going forward. And so that's really the foundation of where Marx is coming from. Okay, for production to go on at all, laborers and the means of production must unite. The specific manner in which this union is accomplished distinguishes the different economic epochs of the structure of society from one another. And that's saying a lot. So, right. So Charles Bettelheim was a French Marxist who died, I think it was 2006, in the early 2000s. And he had written a book some years ago that I found very powerful. And it has this quote in it. The capitalist character of the enterprise is due to the fact that its structure assumes the form of a double separation: the separation of workers from their means of production and the separation of enterprises from each other. And by enterprise, we include any entity that produces, including individuals. This double separation forms the central characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, and it serves as a support for the totality of the contradictions of this mode of production. Okay, the central characteristic and the totality of contradictions. That again, that's saying a lot. So I wanted to connect with capital and show where those separations are identified in capital itself. So first, the separation of workers from their means of production. The capital relation presupposes a complete separation between the workers and the ownership of the conditions for realization of their labor. If you're not in touch with the conditions for realization of your labor, boom, there's no work going to go on, and you're not going to produce anything. And that's chapter 26. It's the chapter on primitive accumulation. And it's a very short chapter, and it's well worth reading, and you don't need any other background in capital to read it. The process, therefore, which creates the capital relation can be nothing other than the process which divorces the worker from the ownership of the conditions of his own labor. So classical political economy wanted to know, how did the capitalists get the money in order to create, to begin capitalism? And Marx says, it's not about that. It's about creating a social relationship, and the social relationship that's created is stripping people who produce from their capacity to produce, by stripping it by monopolizing the means and conditions of production. As soon as capitalist production stands on its own feet, it not only maintains this separation, but reproduces it on a constantly increasing scale. We're not finished with it yet. It goes on every time it goes on. We'll see a little bit later on. All right, now the way, as we'll see, that the separation of workers from the means of production is overcome is by the worker selling labor power as a commodity. The commodity form is presupposed. So Marx begins Capital not with an analysis of the separation of workers from the conditions of production, but with an analysis of the commodity. Quoting the first sentence of Capital, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of the commodity. So then we get to the separation of enterprises from each other. Only such products can become commodities with respect to each other as result from different kinds of labor, like shoemaker, tailor, car production, Nike shoes, bombers, whatever, right? Different kinds of labor, each kind being carried on independently, that is separately, for the account of private individuals. And that's in chapter 1, section 2. Okay, so that's a lot. And we really want to sort of bear down on that question of the double separation. So this is a time to pause for questions. Karen, do you want to, yeah. Go.
Yeah, you kind of, you breezed over a few things there. And I just kind of wanted to make sure, like, you go back and hit the points that you mentioned. So I'm gonna try and like mention the three things that I heard. One is that, you need both workers and the means of production. Without one or the other, society doesn't move forward. And then, the different economic epochs throughout time. And so what happened was that there was a separation naturally. I don't know if we'll get into that, naturally from the feudal times into capitalism. But I don't quite understand how the markets overcome that separation, or
we can hold that question, right? On the overcome. But let's go back to a couple of things you said. First of all, like take slavery, okay? Not slavery in the ancient South, which is already embedded in the capitalist mode of production. I mean, it's still there, but it's still okay, but complications get added. But slavery the slave isn't separated from the conditions of production, from the means of production. They work the tool themselves, right? And so that's why the emphasis of the bourgeoisie is on emancipation, right? So the serf and the slave are emancipated from bondage, and that gives rise to the free worker who's free to sell his or her labor power. But there's more to it than that, because there was in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, there was a period where there was England used to pride itself on the yeoman farmer, right? There was and in Germany as well, there was a significant independence of the small farmer. And that was stripped away. The basis of capitalist production, Marx insists, is expropriation, the expropriation of the means of production from the working person. I wonder if others have questions.
Here's one. Can you say a bit about how Marx's description of capitalism differs from a mainstream understanding of capitalism, or reveals something that is otherwise obscured?
Right. I mean, I I took some economics. I don't remember hearing about separation. I mean, these guys were, there was labor and there was means of production and so forth. But it was just assumed that, like that these things work together. What Marx says in Capital is, nature doesn't produce people with means of production on the one hand, and people with nothing but their labor power on the other, stripped of means of production. So, and I don't remember hearing any of that in mainstream economics, right? And so that, as we'll see, that colors everything, because now the question of where profit comes from, you don't have the capacity to track that to labor. We'll come to that. Folks can jump in vocally, it'd be great.
I have a question on the separation of enterprises from each other. That's not about monopolization, is it? It's more about the separation of a shoemaker's labor and a jacket leather worker's labor.
Yeah, but Florsheim and Nike and GM are all separated from each other also. In other words, enterprises that produce are separated, and it's judicial separation. The private property, it gives expression to that separation.
Can we have somebody with the name Secretary with their hand raised?
I'm not a secretary, but I did raise my hand. Hello?
Hello,
Yeah.
we can.
Hi. Maybe this is jumping ahead of ourselves, but in Marx's day, the big issue was, of course, labor as the source of value in an economy. But now, and I know this has been said in decades past, but automation, I think now can potentially produce much more of basic fundamental human needs without all the marketing and branding that is amplifying our consumption, but just basic human needs. Labor, in the sense of 19th century labor, can really be squeezed out and not as important. In other words, what is the end game of all this? If the end game is to meet fundamental human needs in some utilitarian approach, then can we strive for an automation of labor? Is that a good thing? And I just want you to maybe comment on automation as a role in squeezing out the role of labor.
Yeah, that's really an interesting question. Marx does address automation. I mean, he had the perspective of it. And in fact, one of the huge influences on Marx was Aristotle, and Aristotle was already talking about robots who would, take over the place of slaves. So that's not, certainly the issue has accelerated, but it wasn't as if it wasn't on the horizon. And so, like, I think it was John Stuart Mill, but it could have been someone else. I don't know. One of the political economists of the 19th century, they talked about labor. How machinery, was to save labor. It's so that we'd all have more free time and, and so on and so forth. I haven't noticed that going on, right? We've got a book called The Overworked American and so on and so forth. So, the more we get automated, we can dumb down labor, but it doesn't mean that labor gets less. And the reason is because it's the part of the working day that it makes it possible for the worker to survive gets reduced because of machinery. And that means that the more of the value created by labor is appropriated by capital, but it doesn't change the nature of the capital relation. And we will get into that a little later. Now, the really critical thing about what you suggest in terms of anticipating the future, yes, by all means. I mean, we want to let machines do as much as they can for us, without a doubt, right? But the question is, under what framework is that going to happen? Under what social relation is that going to happen? If it happens under capital, then it's squeezing the worker in order for the capitalist to appropriate the mass of value, and just adding value to value to value. We'll come to that. Or is it for the flourishing of the human person, for our becoming, developing our capacities and powers? And in order for us to develop our capacities and powers, then we have to have a relationship to machinery and to automation that is corresponds to what we are as creatures. And that's not happening now. That's not, the worker has become an accessory to the machine. And we want the goal of production to be the worker themselves. Probably, Karen, we should move on. Do you think? There are some other questions.
We have one more question.
Okay.
From Patrick.
Hi. So, I guess my question is, that's kind of like Marx's, labor is the root of all production, is because, in the beginning of time, or throughout like a lot of early human history, is like we produced all that we consumed. And so by separating this off into these different labor commodities, having the shoemaker, having the other person, that's what this idea is then. Just wanted to clarify and possibly add that.
Well, again, going back to the original slide, you don't produce if you don't have labor on the one hand and raw material, land, means of production on the other. Even reaching up to take a piece of fruit off a tree is the labor of reaching with your hand. So that's that idea of joining human activity. In other words, we have a slide later on. Any living creature has to appropriate and transform nature to its needs, and human persons are no different than that. So we have to transform nature in order to meet our own what it means for us to exist as human creatures on Earth, and of course sustainably, which that's a whole other issue that capitalism isn't addressing. So what happens in terms of the separation that you referred to is we get a social division of labor. And one of the real problems is that emerges spontaneously. And so it's not, what happens is I wind up, the commodity means I produce for you and then you produce for me, but we don't talk about it with each other. And that's got to go badly. And that's basically the way the social division of labor works. We're embedded within a social division of labor, but it's not coordinated at all. And so, and production is separated and private and not coordinated. It's the market that does the coordination, and that's the problem. So, is that responsive to the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. Karen?
Right. So if the worker is separated from the means of production and the means of productions are separated from themselves, how does the market correct that?
All right. So under capitalism, the separation of the worker from the means of production is overcome by the labor market, and the separation of individuals and enterprises producing independently as part of the social division of labor is overcome by the market for goods and commodities. So the product of labor takes the commodity form. And so we need to start, as Marx starts Capital, with the analysis of the market for goods and for the market for commodities, for the products of labor in the commodity form. And so what we get is the simplest, can you guys read that? I'm seeing, I guess, is that too high on the page? Yeah, it's all right. We'll just miss a few words. the simplest form of circulation is CMC. That's commodity, money, commodity. The transformation of commodities into money and the change of money back again into commodities. So I go to market, I take a chair that I produced and I sell it in the market, I get money, and then I use that money to buy eggs for breakfast, okay? And so that's a constant repetition. The thing is though, I'm linked to the guy that buys the chair, I'm linked to the person that sells the eggs, right? And so so CMC, it's an infinite chain. It keeps going, boom, 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 boom. Okay. So somebody can insert themselves not with a chair, but they can just start out with money, and they can enter the chain with at M, and then they're going to have MCM. So they'll have money, and then they exchange it for a commodity, and then they get money back. The transformation of money into commodities and the change of commodities back into money, or buying in order to sell. But, you know, why would anyone want to do that? Why would you want to take money to market and exchange it for a commodity in order to get money back, right? In principle, market exchange is the exchange of equivalents. If a chair is worth $100, it will exchange for a $100 bill. $10 is $10. You know, there's no profit there. So that's obviously not what the person who takes money to market has in mind, is to get the same money back. They want a little more. The cotton that was bought for 100 pounds is perhaps resold for 100 plus 10 pounds or 110 pounds. The exact form of this process is therefore M, money, just is transformed into a commodity, and then it is sold again in order to realize M prime, where M prime is M, the original money invested, plus delta M, the original sum advanced plus an increment. So MCM prime is therefore in reality the general formula of capital as it appears prima facie within the sphere of circulation. In other words, we invest money to add an increment to our original money, and so we emerge with the money invested plus the added increment. But we said that, you know, like $100 exchanged for $100. In other words, circulation, the market, is in principle a matter of equal exchange. And so if equivalents are being exchanged, where does the additional increment, delta M or M prime, come from, right? And so that's, Karen, you can tell us about that.
Well, it comes with the selling of labor power as a commodity, which, if I remember from our class, is what makes capitalism unique from other systems. So next slide. Okay, so Marx says that digestion takes something more than a good stomach. Labor takes more than the ability to labor. As if they sat to eat without food on the table, workers stripped of the access to the means of labor, that is, if they didn't have tools, land, raw materials, and the such, find themselves without the ability to work. They are in the same position as owners of commodities who take their products to market. Workers possess something that they themselves can't use. They've got the ability to labor, but lack the means to labor. So like any commodity owner, the worker's commodity is their labor. They take what they can't use to the market in order to obtain what they can use. They sell their labor power in exchange for a money wage to the class of employers who monopolize the means of production. But labor power is a very special commodity, and in this respect, it is not like other commodities. Its use, labor itself, creates value. That's why Moneybags buys it. He pays workers wages and puts them to work. The wage is determined by the value of those products necessary to get the worker to work each day, what it costs for the worker to survive. food, clothing, shelter, education, training, healthcare, etc. Overall, the wage is determined by what the worker needs to survive. But labor power is sold for a period of time, like a day, a month, a year. The amount of labor required to create the value equivalent to the wage, plus the value a worker can create in a day, are two different. Let me say that again. The amount of labor required to create the value equivalent to the wage and the value a worker can create in a day are two quite different things. The former takes part of a day, the latter takes the whole day. And I have a good example of this. Since working at home, I've realized I can do my job in about a quarter of the time as it takes me when they make me go to work. We call what the worker needs to survive necessary labor. Let's say that takes up a quarter of the working day. The capitalist pays for that. But the worker works for the whole day and creates value during that whole time. The extension of the working day beyond the necessary part is called surplus labor.
So, then we, because there's a necessary part and a surplus part, we can think about dividing the working day. You sell your labor power for the whole day. Engels has an article, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work for a fair day's wage. You sell your labor power for the whole day. The value you receive in a wage is less than the value created during the whole day. That is, the workday is divided into two parts. Necessary labor, the part that's necessary for you to survive, and surplus labor, the part that makes up the rest of the day, the part taken by capital. And that's true of slavery and serfdom as well. In other words, there's a necessary part. You got to keep the slave alive, you got to keep the serf alive. And then there's a surplus part, the part taken by the master or the lord. Thus, on the line below, let AB equal necessary labor and BC equal surplus labor. Then the working day divided into two parts might look like this. And so the necessary part, that's in terms of what I was saying earlier about, the capitalist wants to reduce that, and machinery will reduce the cost of the labor required for the worker to survive. So A and B, for example, in the 19th century in Capital, Marx's A, B will go up to 3/4 of the way up towards C, or even more, right? You have 10 hours of a 12-hour day are necessary labor, and the capitalist gets 2 hours. Now, I can't imagine what it would be, but it's certainly a very short period of time, and the capitalist gets the excess. So let's see, maybe we ought to stop here and take questions about those, both the labor market and the market for goods and commodities as we've briefly presented them here.
We have a question from Noble.
Hello. So I guess I just had a question about why does the surplus labor exist? If I'm a boss and I am extracting the surplus labor, then there might be another boss that could be I can get away with extracting less surplus labor and still make at least some profit, and then they could pay their workers more. So I guess why does that not happen? Why is there not a boss which extracts less surplus labor and pays the workers more if there's this surplus labor? And
that's an interesting question. In other words, I think it could happen. The critical question is, if you took less surplus labor as an employer, then you could sell less than the next person. That's what you're asking, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if
Right.
you're competing for workers.
Right. And I think the critical answer is here on this slide. MCM prime is therefore in reality the general formula of capital as it appears prima facie within the sphere of circulation. In other words, I'm going to take that M prime. The M prime is made up of the surplus labor. That's where the delta M comes from, right? And I'm going to take that and invest it again, right? It doesn't stop with one instance here. I invest it again, and if I'm not, you know, so I have less to invest now under the scenario that you give. I have less to invest. Well, that means the guy next to me is producing on a greater scale, and he's able to go under me, and I can't keep up because I can't match. I haven't invested enough to match the savings in terms of scale that person's been able to achieve. So that's, in other words, this MCM, that's unlimited. It doesn't stop. I mean, the adding money to money goes on ad infinitum, and that's why capitalists can't innovate our way out of the climate crisis, because there's always that question of pushing the need to keep coming up with ways of increasing surplus labor.
I guess
I see. So like
kind of
if you
piggyback on that.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Noble.
Oh, sorry. So I guess if you take less surplus labor, then you'll go out of business because you're not able to compete.
That's the idea. You won't be as competitive.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
My question, I guess, would be like, if you go back to the money, commodity, money prime, is there a limit to the money prime? Is there a limit to how much value can be created, or does it just go on infinitely?
Well, again, that goes back to that original question that we had, which was so good. In other words, there is a limit in terms of A and B, right? You can't shrink beyond what is necessary to keep working people alive. So that's that. There is a minimum physiological limit there, and then B to C, the limit is the working day, 24 hours, right? And so, in 19th century capitalism, I mean, we're talking about 12 hours. I mean, my dad used to always talk about, maybe it wasn't apocryphal, always talk about, you know, like working 12 hours a day in the brickyard and so forth, you know. And so, and actually there was a grandfather, I think, who did do that. But anyway, that, you know, in the 19th century, it was 12 hours a day, it was 16 hours a day, it was 18 hours a day, you know, and horrendous overwork. A horse, Marx emphasized, you can work 8 hours a day and that's it, but not a human being. They work, it was much more, the exploitation was much more intense than that. And so that, not only is there resistance to the working class, but the capital can't survive under that condition, because you know, everybody's got to add another minute to the working day in order to beat their competitor. And so capital imposes restrictions on the working day in its own interest, not to speak of the fact that the working class gets good and fed up. But in terms of, as I said, it goes back to the first question, because value comes from labor, right? And if, to the extent that machinery becomes more and more and more and more part of the product, the value that's in the machine gets transferred to the product, gets transferred to the result, right? So it's not, value doesn't increase. I buy a machine and there's no increase in value that occurs from and in the machine itself. So to the extent that the machine takes up a greater and greater and greater part of the working day, then there's less and less profit to be extracted from labor. And the fact that there's less and less profit that gets extracted from labor, yes, there is capitalism is on a trajectory to make that so small that it's no longer workable. Other questions? Should we move on?
We have another hand raised, which is Kurt.
Hi. So I was wondering, would you say that the end of the profitability in the money commodity, money prime relationship is coming near in today's late stage capitalism, at least in America, with companies like Uber who have never made a profit and still remain?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question. What we do know from history is that capital has an amazing capacity to reinvent itself in that sense. So, but that, yeah, that's an interesting point. I think the crisis is getting more and more and more acute. At what point it just simply can't go on, I don't have any, I don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate the insight, though.
Okay. Markets overcome capital separations, but there are multiple problems. They overcome them to reproduce them, right? The worker, it gets as a wage what the worker needs to survive, but then they produce value during the day, and the capitalist takes the surplus of what's produced and invests it in machinery, invests it in new plant and equipment, and so on and so forth. And so the worker never, because they only get that minimum necessary to survive, they never get the capacity to break out of this cycle. In other words, the separation of the worker from the conditions of production is reproduced by the labor market, by the exchange of labor for a wage. Secondly, markets create us as individuals. That's and emerge at the individual as we know it in the Western world emerges with the expansion of markets and the emergence of capital. Marx calls this in the second chapter of Capital, the individuals, they find themselves in a relationship of reciprocal isolation. And that pretty much describes our social, where we are as people. And thirdly, our social being depends on a validation of market exchange. Unless you have something to take to market, you don't exist as a social individual. In other words, you need a certification that what you've done, what you've produced is, has been validated by the market. That's not true, for example, of indigenous thought. Indigenous thought takes the individual, it presupposes the individual as part of the social body. So those are just three. There are others, but those are three that get us started. So is there a socialist alternative? All right. So the question is whether we can restore the original union between the individual and nature, the working person and nature and the instruments they use to produce in a new historical form. Here's a quote from Marx from Value, Price, and Profit that I find extraordinarily important. The separation between the man of labor and the instruments of labor, once established, such a state of things will maintain itself and reproduce itself upon a constantly increasing scale until a new and fundamental revolution in the mode of production should again overturn it and restore the original union in a new historical form. So we're talking about an original union between the person who labors and the instruments of labor that connect them to nature. And we're saying that capitalism emerges by separating those things, the persons who work and the instruments and resources with which they work. And so now we're asking if we can put those back together again in a new historical form. So let me read that quote again. The separation between the man of labor and the instruments of labor, once established, such a state of things will maintain itself and reproduce itself upon a constantly increasing scale until a new and fundamental revolution in the mode of production should again overturn it and restore the original union in a new historical form. So what does that mean? In a new historical form? What, I mean, now we're challenged to try and figure out, like, what's the vision here? What does this mean? Capitalism has given us the factory and the assembly line. And so these involve workers gathered together under the control of capital, right? The worker, it's no longer a matter of working with a spindle at home or the hand loom or the handheld plow or the shoemaker at the lathe. In other words, these persons were all working individually with their own tools and so forth. The capitalism rests on the association of people within the factory, on the assembly line, where the worker becomes an accessory of the machine, not the instrument of labor, as carrying the intention of the worker to the raw material. Instead, it's the machine that's in control, and the worker's an accessory that keeps the machine going. So how can the original union between the working person, nature, and the instruments of labor be restored, given that we work now in association with one another? So I'd like to pause there just to let that issue, that problem, sink in. Karin, maybe there are folks have questions.
Does anybody have any questions about the new historical form? What is meant by that? Kurt?
I have a question. I don't want to take the word of Marx as if he is a prophet. Why are we to believe that the revolution shall restore the working person into its original union rather than some sort of chaos and mutual destruction or something or the other? Why would it go to the original union again?
Yeah, there are certainly no guarantees. I think what Marx is saying is not this is what's going to happen. It's this is what has to happen if we're going to find a way out of this that is human and sustainable.
Andrew?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So I'm wondering about this union of labor, the laborer and the instruments of labor. Does it mean that you kind of have to work with your hands in order and really be materially providing for your own survival, or does it mean something more along the lines of that you through some sort of process have some control over like the purpose for which what your labor produces is used?
Yeah, that's exactly the question, Andrew. In other words, that's what does it mean, right? That's exactly the question. And we know that Marx insisted on the importance of overcoming the separation between mental and manual labor, right? So that's one aspect of it. The other thing is at the beginning of the chapter on the labor process, where Marx describes, I'm sure folks have heard of the, the worst architect, the thing that distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees, who, create these amazing structures by themselves. The worst architect is different because the architect plans in their head before they realize in execution. And so that's what happens when there's this original union. The individual has an idea in their head, and then they use the instrument to execute it in nature on the land, or with resources, metals, or whatever. And so what capitalism does is to separate the planning, right, which is done completely by management, by and so forth, and the execution, which is carried out by the working class. So the separation of mental and manual labor, the separation of planning and execution, both those are on the agenda. In other words, how do we reestablishing the original union in a new historical form overcome those separations? So I'll have more to say about that as we move along.
Are there any other questions about that? Oh, we've got one from Secretary again.
I don't know why it says Secretary. My name's Eben. Hi.
Hi.
I have a bit of a complex question here, but I want to tie some of the things that you've mentioned thus far together. This idea of the union that Marx envisioned might not have envisioned large-scale commodity availability that we call utilities right now. For example, utilities, CMP right now. Marx predated electricity, so we have reasons to have certain kinds of infrastructure that can be in the public domain. And so today on Point on WBR in Boston, there was a thing about Amazon Web Services being recognized as a utility because we have a Zoom call right now that is using Amazon. And so rather than make these in the hands of private capital, these could be publicly owned and publicly controlled. So given that sort of macroeconomic twist to things, I wonder if you might comment on, and if you're going to comment on, this chain of MCM having a beginning with the issuance of currency by a sovereign entity and an end, which is taxation. So that's putting a modern monetary theory lens on things and having that sort of public control over the whole scenario, over the whole of what we recognize as necessities for a functioning society as utilities, and having those be ultimately publicly managed. I realize it's a lot to unpack, but I wonder if you can comment on it.
Say the last part again. In other words, where you said about I'm unclear in terms of where the public entity is intervening in MCM prime.
Well, so this is taking it from the lens of modern monetary theory, which is that the sovereign issuer of currency creates the money through spending, and
right, okay.
the end of that chain is retrieving some of that money through taxation, maybe Pigouvian taxes or whatever, but not
right.
That the taxes don't serve the purpose of collecting the money first in order to spend it. So the great orchestrator is the political the fiscal decisions on what to spend on.
Right. Okay. It's hugely complex and hugely interesting. My understanding, and obviously, the creation of fiat money and going off the gold standard, that adds a significant wrinkle. My understanding is the creation of money, no matter, push comes to shove, that's a promise on future labor. You haven't changed the nature of money. Money is a claim on the labor of others. And so you're issuing a promise on the future labor of others. And then that comes, and so that's the way that cycle goes forward. And so the second point I would make on that score is that we're talking, in other words, the transition from feudalism to capitalism took a very long time. And the transition from capitalism to socialism is going to take a long time. And so it's one thing to have a perspective of like where really to get out of this mess we want to go. And another thing to say, you know, like, well, wait a second, what is step one? What is step two? What is step three? And step one is not going to look like, you know, step 49 going to 50, which is end game, you know. And so I think it's important to have that the distinction between the immediate view and then the long view. And so what I would say about the long view is we already have history about that, because we've had a socialist revolution, and we've had an effort to put socialism in place, and it failed. There's an interesting footnote in Marx. It's just a little footnote and a little reference to it, but it really triggered my attention because he talks about the emergence of capitalism in 14th century Venice, I think it was, and then there was a restoration of feudalism, and so we've seen ourselves a restoration of capitalism in countries where there was an effort to create a socialist economy. All right, what we can draw from that experience, what we learned, is that if you're not overcoming the separation between planning and execution, if you're not overcoming the distinction between mental and manual labor, if you're not overcoming the separation of workers from control over the conditions of production, right, you're not out of the woods yet. And so that's what I would say about the public entity that is, has a supervisory role over the process here. In other words, it's going to, the class struggle continues after the revolution, and it's going to, those separations, if they persist, we've got to stay on a trajectory of overcoming separation, or we're in trouble, I think. Yeah. Is that, I hope that was clear. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I want to, if I could respond, just you mentioned that the issuance of fiat currency is predicated on a promise of future labor. I have up to this point thought of it purely in terms of promise of future capacity, whether that capacity is necessarily through labor, an increase in labor, or an increase in certain kinds of labor, certain kinds of trades, dental care, for example. If we have dental care for all, as is proposed with Bernie's plan, it's a question of, do we have the capacity to deliver that? So it's not just labor, but it's also schools, actual brick and mortar schools, actual clinics, and that sort of thing. So it's
sure.
I don't. Anyway,
yeah, I don't think I'm saying anything different than that in terms of going back to the idea that labor is the thing that creates value. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the extended attention to that.
Yeah. All right, so let's go on and pick up some of the again, we're not talking about between today and tomorrow. We're talking about a long-range vision here. The socialist task is not to return to the handloom. Labor is the associated labor of many cooperating and coordinating with each other. This is labor today, right? It's the associated labor of many cooperating and coordinating with each other, not only in the factory, but also across industries, branches of production, and continents. Oh gosh, so this is, let me see, I've got this. I hope you can see at the top of the screen there. I can't. So let me.
Do you want me to read it for you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Socialism means working people taking control of the conditions of production democratically and participatively. I'm going to say that right. And fully so.
And together we can coordinate the distribution of total available social labor to meet actual social need, including what we need to be fully human. So that goes back to Andrew's question. In other words, I think what in terms of restoring the original union, the challenge to us is to figure out how to do that democratically and participatively. And so, you know, that may, like, for example, if people are going to participate and meetings are going to be a way of means, you know, a way we participate, we get together and talk about stuff. People may need training in order to participate in meetings, right? They may need training in public speaking or this, that, or the other thing. So, and I think, Andrew, that the idea of right, it's not a question that everybody has to be turning over dirt. I think there are still relevant divisions of labor, but that the idea is that it really has to be that we're acting co-deliberatively, we're acting democratically and participatively, and somehow that has real meaning. It has to have real meaning, and so that's the original. In other words, what strikes me about this is, when I spoke before about capitalism drawing workers together, right? What we've got is capitalism has actually socialized the means of production. You can't operate a car plant, right, with a single worker, although maybe we'll come to that, but you can't operate the car plant. It's workers working together that make the car plant possible, and so on, right? And so given that circumstance, that's where we start. Again, you know, like we don't have to accept that as the end, as the final place, but that's where we start. And that's been given, that's a legacy of capital, right? And so we've got people associated. Now, how are we going to restore that original union in a new historical form if, you know, like we're talking about associated labor like that? And I mean, you can't do it except democratically. You can't do it with one-man management as there was in the Soviet Union. It doesn't work. It's got to be democratic. It's got to be participative. And we've got to figure out what that means and how far we can take that, right? That's the real challenge to us. What does it mean to operate, you know, like a workshop, a factory, a nation, and a globe democratically and participatively, and fully so? And if we do that, right, then we can, you know, now I guess I said before, you know, like I take commodity to market. A commodity is, the character of a commodity is it's something produced for others. Okay, so I take commodity to market for you, and you take commodity to market for me, and we don't coordinate what we're doing, right? And so that's got to go badly. That's what I said before. It's just, it doesn't make sense, right? And so now what we can, and not only that, we're not coordinating, but I'm into it for adding money, the money increment that I'm capable of getting, and you're into it to, you know, get the money increment that you're interested in getting. And money is just value. It's dead labor. Value is labor that's already been put into something, into a thing, right? And it's embodied there, it's crystallized there. And so that's dead labor. And so what we're talking about when we talk about M, C, M prime, we're talking about adding dead labor to dead labor, right? And so that's where we're at. Well, instead, why not talk about an economy where we coordinate the distribution of all our labors to meet actual social needs, and including the need of what it means to be fully human, right? And that we still have a lot to discover on that score. You're certainly not going to discover that under capitalism. So the goal of production under socialism, instead of profit as a means to add money to money without end, socialists build a society where the full and free development of every individual forms the ruling principle, Marx. That's in Capital. Human flourishing, not the increase of value, is the goal of production. Marx proposed a banner across the socialist commonwealth: from each according to ability, to each according to need. A boundlessly radical vision of how to achieve the full and free development of every individual. I mean, think of how radical that is, right? So one way to think about that is there's some literature today about contributive justice. Justice, the way we think about it, goes back to Aristotle, right? It's distributive justice. You get what you're due, and the model of distributive justice is equal exchange in a market. That's where it comes from. Well, contributive justice starts from this idea of from each according to ability to each according to need. What we want to do is make it possible for everybody to contribute to our existence in society to the, to the most we can, and by being the most we can, right? So contributive justice means securing for each the opportunity to contribute fully and freely to social life. Since individuals differ from one another in their powers and capacities, the effort of all has to be to maximize the ability of each to contribute in a way that fully realizes their talents and needs and aspirations and abilities. And so, again, as I said, it seems to me boundlessly radical. Like any living creature, human persons live, survive, and flourish by transforming nature to need. Labor is activity transforming nature, including human nature, to need. What is life but activity, Marx wrote. Through the activity of transforming nature, we discover what it is to be human. How impoverished the world capitalism has built suggests we are. Capitalism requires that I establish my social belonging by taking a product to market for which I receive money or other value in exchange. Socialism will build a society where my social belonging is presupposed by my simple existence, and where not only necessary labor, but also the dance of all the creative potential latent within me finds material expression in my activity, in the free play of my discovered powers and capacities, and where my activity, both necessary and free, has become labor as life's prime need. That's activity. My activity of transforming the world that's where I live. That's where I exist. All right, so Karen, we've got to have a bunch of questions coming out of that stuff. Who's got questions?
Kurt has a question.
I have two questions. My first one is if you are familiar with the economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth by Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah, not really. No, I'm not.
Well, I'm not too familiar with it, but his idea of socialism kind of disagrees with your democratic. They think that the democratic, without the markets, you wouldn't be able to attribute a value to how much people need as opposed to how much people have, So I just was wondering if you could go a little more in depth as to how your democratic
Okay, so Kurt, go back and say the collapsed idea that you had of why we need markets. Go ahead, say that your understanding of what he says about that. Did we lose Kurt?
Sorry, my internet is really bad. I couldn't hear you.
Okay. Oh, okay. I was going to ask if you would say again what your understanding of what Mies said was, but let me go ahead with what you said, and then you can correct me if I'm not on target. There's a couple of things about that. First, you say that he says that we need markets, and we don't have equality, we don't have democracy or freedom without markets. The thing is, the social division of labor is anarchic, right? There's no conscious coordination there. So that's the first thing. So yeah, you have a freedom that is like that Marx has the idea that we realize ourselves in association with others, right? Think of music. I mean, it takes it takes our relationship to others to enjoy music, and so as an expression of our humanity, that particular, like we need association with others, in other words, for those things to be realized. Okay, secondly, in terms of markets, yes, markets give us equality, and Marx has a terrific analysis of that, but it gives us equality in a formal sense, in the sense of exchange. So we get exchange value. And so I take a product to market. My product that I've made is, is particular to me. It reflects, the characteristics of my personality and so on and so forth. And I take it to market, and what do I get? I get, like money, value, which is completely impersonal, right? It doesn't, if I pass you a dollar bill, that doesn't say a thing about me, right? So what I am as a specific real human being gets completely ignored by the market. And so Marx has a whole criticism, starting with his very early writing, 25, 26 years old. He has this criticism of formal citizenship, because you participate formally in public life. You don't, and all that actually concerns you as a real human being gets left behind. So everybody is equal before the law. Compare that with from each according to ability, to each according to need, right? From each according to ability, to each according to need means we're talking about real human beings. We're not talking about formal equality where, I sue Gates and we're formally equal before the law. That's BS, right? And so, yeah, the bourgeois society rests on equality as a formal characteristic and freedom as a formal characteristic. So I'm completely free, and I don't have to sell my labor to this capitalist. I don't have to sell my labor to that capitalist. I don't have to sell my labor to any capitalist, right? But I also don't have the capacity to survive. So I better figure out a way to change my mindset, so I'll sell it to someone. So I think that's the basis. You can look superficially at the market and come away thinking, oh, this is the source of freedom and equality. But in fact, you look further and you realize, wait a second, this is formal. It's not dealing with our actual lived lives.
All right. Yeah, I agree with all that. All that makes sense, I guess. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great.
That was very insightful.
Andrew?
Can you talk at all about like how it is that some people come to be mere workers and deprived of the means of production, and some people come to be capitalists who have control over the means of production? Like historically, how does that kind of class division even originate?
Yeah, well, birth is helpful. I mean, we found that out right in the recent period. There are all kinds of studies that show that, the best way to, live a good life is to be born right. But going back to what you said, how it emerges, again, that chapter 26, and then it's only 4 pages, maybe 5 pages. It's a very good introduction. And then the chapter immediately following is about the expropriation of the agricultural laborer. And Marx says at the end of chapter 26, the last paragraph, he says, the basis of the emergence of capital is the expropriation of the working person. That's the basic idea. And so that was accomplished. And again, the chapters that follow go through this. That was accomplished by enclosing the commons, right? You just kick people off the land. So, like a lord had, jurisdiction over a county and so on and so forth. But this was attached with all kinds of customs and laws that came down from the feudal period that said, okay, I'm a peasant. I have a right to my, my garden plot on which I survive, and I have a right to use the commons to gather wood, to hunt, and and so on and so forth. And suddenly, because now it was a matter of raising sheep for wool that could be shipped to Holland, the commons was enclosed. You put up fences. You kicked out the people that were living there, and now they're suddenly on the road. And then you ask, well, why aren't you guys at work? Like it's craziness. And so then what you got in England was the legislation against vagabondage, right? The legislation against the expropriated. And you punished them for not having a job. You drove them into the workshops. So that's one. Expropriation and closure of the commons. I mean, on the land where we sit, right? This mentality was imported from England and resulted in the dispossession of Native Americans and of indigenous people around the world. And so that dispossession was it was driven by the idea that, well, oh, okay, yeah, I can see these people did a little gardening and so on and so forth, and these forests really look like they're well managed and so forth, but they're not producing exchange value, so they're worthless, right? It's waste. And so then capitalists use it to produce exchange value, and then what you come up with is real waste. Like if you read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about Onondaga Lake and how, where people lived and had a flourishing, commonwealth, it's under 60 feet of sludge, right? So, I mean, and then Marx goes into, colonialism throughout the globe and slavery and so forth. So those were the forms in which the original separation of the worker from the conditions of production took. Is that responsive?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
I think a person could go could do. It's not at all like it's not an error to start reading Capital at chapter 26 and go right through to the end. Those are terrific chapters and they're very readable. And they give you a real understanding of the emergence of capitalism.
So we have just about 10 minutes left. So we have time for maybe one or two more questions, and then Howard, are there more slides, or was this the last one?
No, this is it.
Okay.
This one with labor is life's prime need at the end. And again, that's not, like Marx has a place where he goes over Adam Smith said this, that, and the other thing, and I remember actually going into an economics classroom, and the graphs would grow up on the board and so forth. Labor was graphed as a bad, right? It's a cost, and so you labor, you incur a cost with your, you're sweating, you're using your, expenditure of labor and so forth in order to obtain a good, right? That's not Marx. Marx says, well, of course, he has the bourgeois idea of labor. Labor is the activity of transforming the world. That's where we find out who we are, what we're capable of. And that was my point about capitalism. Like obviously capitalism has like exploded our understanding of lots of things, but it's also, I mean, if you look at the world around you, you think, well, wait a second, what kind of creature did this? So.
Do we have any Any final question?
I really appreciated the questions. Let's have a few more in the minutes left.
Noble.
Hello. This might be a little unrelated, but like, I took an economics class when I was in high school, and like they always talk about like supply and demand curves, like it's like related to labor. Like I think like they would say like labor is like the supply curve because like there's workers supplying labor, and then there's like a demand curve that like slopes downward with like because employers like demand labor, they want workers, and like there's like a point where they meet in the middle, and that like represents like the benefit that they're getting from workers equals the cost of workers. And I was wondering like what do you think about that, or like do you think that's like is that realistic, or is that like a bad model, or like I don't know, but yeah.
I'm grateful to Karn for having raised that question earlier in our conversations. And Marx, the way in which Marx deals with that, without a doubt, supply and demand affects the market price of things. In other words, if the supply is in short supply, then like the costs will go up, and that'll account for example, that accounts for if I'm about to invest, I'll move into an area where there's more money to be made because the supply is weak, right? And so supply and demand play an enormously important role. But the question is, when supply and demand meet, when those lines cross, what's the point where they meet? What accounts for the point of equilibrium where they meet? And so Marx's thing is, well, that's the amount of labor embodied in them.
Sorry, could you explain the amount of labor embodied in them? Like that's the amount of labor the workers are providing, or?
Yes, absolutely. It's the amount of labor. The labor provides the labor, right? Actually, that question of how to talk about labor in the sense of the labor that creates value is itself pretty complicated, and I think we don't have time to get into it. We could do another thing to talk about that is something along those lines. Sure. Or get in touch with me and we can have a conversation about that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. How would I get in touch with you? Sorry.
I'll put an email. Let's see, Joe, maybe we can work with that and arrange that.
I can do that. Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, we've got a few minutes left. There were a couple other. Andrew, you had another question.
Yeah. So when you were talking about like the task for socialism, what socialism is about, it's kind of there's a high standard set, but is it would you say that it's indeterminate as to how that's done? Like there isn't like one way that like socialism says you have to organize an economy and a society, and rather it's a kind of an open question in terms of the way that logistically that standard can be achieved.
Yeah, again, that's really that takes us a long way. Marx, you probably run into the point that Marx didn't make blueprints about what the future society would look like, and so that's the challenge to us. And I think what I've tried to suggest here comes out of the idea that, well, wait a second, where we're starting is with capitalism insofar as it's socialized the means of production. And so if we're going to take, reestablish the original union between labor and nature and the instruments of labor, if we're going to put that together in a package, now that we've got the division of mental and manual labor, which we want to overcome, the division of planning and execution, which we want to come, if we're going to do all that, I think it very much depends on where we are, who we're working with, the scale of the organization that we're thinking of, and so on and so forth. I mean, like you can work with one group and, you go and you have to do things one way to work with another group and you do another. And so obviously extend that to the level of, geographical units and nations and so on and so forth. And you've got to take differences into account. And Marx always insisted on that. But I do think, coming back to the question of what the legacy of capital is in terms of socializing the means of production, I mean, it does provide parameters for us. And those parameters are, if we're working together with one another, I mean, like either you're working hierarchically or you're working democratically. And hierarchically creates classes, and we're looking for a classless society. So we've got to be working democratically. And that means we got to be engaging in real forms of participation. We can't say we have a very limited idea of what participation would look like, right? But we know we've got, so okay, let's take an example, right? I mean, like you can't take the folks doing clerical stuff or cleaning in a hospital and send them up to do brain surgery, but the brain surgeon can empty bedpans, right? We can begin to overcome the division between mental and manual labor. We can begin to break down the hierarchies that have established themselves.
Okay, I think we can do one final question.
Well, it's great. I've enjoyed this a whole lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, for organizing this.
Hey,
Joe,
thank
do
you
you want
both
to
so much.
say something about the next session?
Yeah, so I'll send out an invite to the next session, which is on socialism and oppression. It's about race, class, and the carceral state. And that'll all be in your inbox. And we have one in 2 months from now. It'll be the final session. And I think that's on internationalism. So if you enjoyed this one, or you didn't and you want to come and see what we're up to again, please do check your inbox, and I'll send that out later. I think probably tomorrow morning, so it's fresh. And thanks so much. If you're interested in other stuff in the DSA, it's just smdsa.org. We have a calendar with other events and ways to get involved in other ways too. Put that in the chat right now.